Okay. Well, first I'm going to start off. I got some handouts here for everybody.
Yeah,
Few ones backwards. Take one, pass those around.
by lot.
Just a bit of a list of supply resources, where I get them, things like that. So, all right, I guess I'm going to start off with a little bit of an introduction, tell you a little bit about me, who I am, how I got here. Yeah, my name's Brian, I'm a luthier. Hi, Brian. It's a 12 fret program. No. Been a lifelong professional woodworker. A lot of my family before me has been lifelong professional woodworkers, so it kind of came naturally to me. I've played guitar since I was a small boy, around 9 years old, from what I remember. So, you know, eventually it only seems natural that working with wood, trying to build guitars would come about. This isn't my first attempt at actually building guitars. I tried this once before, back in the late 80s, early 90s. I tried to build electric guitars, and I pretty much failed miserably at that. Never managed to complete a single playable instrument. It was a complete and utter failure. So I found that for me personally, I had to go learn to be an expert cabinet maker and then come back and be able to actually build a guitar. But for the past 2 years or so, I'm back to building guitars, and I think I'm building some real fine guitars. Anyway, that's enough about me. Let's get to why we're here. French polish. I assume everybody wants to learn how to do it. All right, well, let's start off with what French polish is and what it is not. Does anyone know what shellac actually is, by the way? French polish is actually just another name for a shellac finish. When I first heard the name French polish, I got excited. It was something new. After, 30 years of woodworking, something new, something uncovered from the days of old. And I come to find out it's just pretty much a similar shellac process to what I've seen my uncles and other old Dutchmen doing my whole life. So French polish is shellac. Anyone know what shellac is?
Come from a shellac bug.
Yep. You'll find one of my favorite questions is why. I need to understand why things are done as much as how they're done. It helps me improve my process. I mean, understanding why something is or is not, maybe I'm already addressing that in another way, or maybe the way you do it takes care of 3 things I was doing differently. I don't know. So I always ask why. All right. Yes, shellac is from the shellac beetle. Shellac beetles suck the sap out of trees in the Near East, and they secrete a protein. And then people go around and scrape this protein off the trees, and that's basically raw shellac. Now it gets processed a bunch of different ways and gets turned into the products that you're probably more familiar with that you either order from your suppliers or pick up at the hardware store. But it's a completely natural protein. And as such, it's actually completely edible. Matter of fact, most of you have probably eaten shellac and don't even know it. It's used as a common glaze for a lot of candies and other confections. Completely inert and harmless. Also, being a natural protein, I think those of you who are all about the protein glues will probably agree with this. It has an acoustical transparency to it, being a natural protein. A lot of that, I think, has more to do with the fact that you can actually apply a French polish at about half the thickness you can a lacquer or any other finish. I think it's just thinner, allows more of the sound to actually come through. But I have no proof that it's not actually because it's a natural protein. It's also very beautiful. It's a beautiful finish, and it ages very, very well. It develops a beautiful natural patina. So let's talk about the history and the myths of shellac and French polish, because I'm sure a lot of you folks have probably heard a lot of things about French polish. Like I'm sure most of you have actually heard that you got to use a de-waxed shellac. Most of you heard that? And no, not true. Matter of fact, you're probably better off not using a de-waxed shellac. For those of you who don't know, fully waxed shellacs were the finish on virtually every ballroom floor and gymnasium floor in this country until about the mid-1960s, when a synthetic came along that could actually replace them. finish is tough enough for a ballroom floor, probably tough enough for this guitar right here. I'm not going to dance on that. So where's this de-wax thing come from? Well, most of what's being done in French polish today hasn't been handed down through the generations. It all goes back to, everyone's guide seems to point back to one source. There was a handyman's reference, the first handyman's reference book published at the turn of the 1900s. And it had a chapter dedicated to French polishing. And that's where most of the stuff goes back to. It was the beginning of the arts and crafts movement. It was that can-do. People actually had leisure time now. They could have hobbies. They could build arts and crafts furniture in their spare time. And this was the reference book for them. Now it is based on the processes being used in industry at the time, but why was industry using a de-waxed shellac in the first place? Anyone know why we would even want to take the wax out of a shellac? De-waxing shellac does one thing for the shellac that's beneficial in certain instances. It improves its resistance to water. As time went on, iced drinks became more popular because ice became readily available. We all know what happens when you let a sweaty glass sit on your table, right? Get that big white ring. Shellac's really bad at that. A natural shellac like this, it'll ruin it. It'll bubble it right back off the wood and take it right down to bare wood. That was unacceptable for furniture. Someone discovered by taking the wax out of the shellac, that was no longer the case. You trade a lot of durability when you do that, though, which is why this finish probably has a reputation for being less durable. You probably hear that all the time. Ooh, French polish is not very durable. You're going to have to refinish the tops every couple of years if someone plays the guitar a lot. This guitar is a year old. It's had the living daylights played out of it. I play it personally at least an hour a day just for fun and amusement. I let other people play it. I lend it out to people. It's been dropped and kicked around. If you come up and take a look at it, you'll see the scars where someone dropped it on a concrete floor about 30 inches. You know, it didn't all chip and flake off. It's got a couple scratches in it, and that's about it. It's a very durable finish. Also, most of you are probably familiar with the fact that everyone tells you got to put olive oil on your pad or your mouse when you French polish to lube it, or it's going to stick. Well, yeah, if you're using a de-waxed shellac, you're going to have to do something to lubricate it, or that pad's going to stick fast and just rip all the shellac back off. Use a wax shellac, and you don't got to put no olive oil in your finish, and then you don't got to waste your time getting the olive oil back out of the finish. So those are some of the reasons I actually like this type of finish. Is it quick and easy? No, this is a lot of work. Those of you guys looking for a quick, easy, do-it-yourself finish, spraying lacquer is still the tops. Nothing easier than shooting some lacquer and waiting a couple weeks to sand it and buff it. This is work. This is a lot like sanding, constantly. 40 or 50 hours worth of it per instrument. So let's actually get into the process. Okay? First thing you got to do, of course, is preparation. Most finishes fail right here. Most of your finishes are failing at the prep stage. I don't care what kind of finish you're going to put over top of it. If your preparation is not good, your finish will not be good. There's just no two ways around it. So you've really got to take your time, be careful. I scrape and sand the entire instrument. First I'll go through and I'll scrape everything down nice and level. Then I'll come back and I'll sand it all to a 180. I get everything nice and flush. Then I'm going to clean the whole instrument off. I'm going to dust it off. I'm going to inspect it very, very carefully. I'm going to go around. I'm going to look at all my bindings and purflings. I'm going to look at my rosette. Any major defects, and I mean anything that I can like probably stick a probe or something into, like a piece of a cut off guitar string, probably going to get addressed. I use an all wood binding with a white glue, so I can generally loosen anything like that I would find back up and get it to re-adhere. Those of you guys who use plastic and Duco, I don't know what you're going to do when you find a gap behind yours, except do what I do. Next, I'll go through and anything that absolutely needs filled. If I find something that's a little bit low, or something I just can't get back apart, like maybe a little divot in a rosette or something that would need filled, I'll make notes of them, I'll come back in and I'll fill them. I fill them with the same material I use for my pour fill a lot of times. So, as has no adverse reactions with any adhesives that I'm aware of. I see no reason to use anything harsher than alcohol.
What alcohol are you using? Because there's different alcohol.
All right, well, what alcohol am I using? I use almost exclusively the Clean Strip Green. It's 95% pure. It's got the minimum amount of denaturants in it. It's actually the same, basically the same proportions as Everclear, which is almost impossible to get here in the People's Republic of Pennsylvania. You can
You need
get
a medical license to get it.
You can get it for other reasons too. I could actually go and apply and do
Yeah,
that.
I tried at the state store and they.
Yeah, you still got to pay the bottle
You a
tax
doctor?
on it and everything. This is just so much. I mean, in the end, it's more economical. It's easy. I can pick this up at Home Depot or any place.
Belong to a fraternity, you can get a lot of it.
Got to go to Maryland.
Penn State.
I didn't say
Or the
that.
state pen.
Parts of too.
Can I ask you, does that alcohol do anything to, if I had the plastic bindings, does it, but reacts with nothing?
It shouldn't, no.
Okay.
You should always conduct a small test somewhere to be absolutely positive
Okay.
yourself.
Yeah.
Don't trust me or anyone else. I'm not really an expert. I just play one in internet chat rooms. I've never seen it react negatively with anything other than a shellac finish. Or,
Oh,
you know.
okay.
I mean, an alcohol-based finish like shellac, it will eat
It'll
right
eat
back
it right
off.
out.
That's why I say there comes
Well, I
a
was
point.
worried about the glue reacting with the plastic.
I've had glue react with acetone and dark line on
Yeah,
there.
that's what
So
I'm
I don't
currently-
use any acetones. I don't use anything mineral based at this point. I wipe everything down with a nice, just clean rags and alcohol. And I'm actually fussy at this stage. I actually buy clean cotton and cut up for the rags. I don't just use rags. I don't even trust the stuff you buy at the paint store. I see stuff on those rags, so, you know.
Does it evaporate quickly? I'm
Yeah, it
sorry,
does.
So I'm
Yeah,
gonna
it's all-
wet the rag with it pretty well, dampen the wood.
It's almost as quick as naphtha.
Okay.
It evaporates almost as quick as naphtha.
Quick.
So okay, so we got it all prepped. We got it all cleaned up. Now we're actually ready to do some filling. First thing we're gonna have to do, unless you're maybe building a maple guitar or something that doesn't require a pour fill. But I would still come back at this point, even if I was using maple for my sides and didn't need a pour fill, I would still come back and fill my wood bindings. I would need to fill the wood in my rosette. That's got pores in it. I would, of course, need to fill my mahogany neck, you know. So I'm still gonna have some filling to do. But we'll assume we're talking a porous wood like this rosewood here or mahogany and we need to pour fill. I use for that product by System 3. It's an epoxy. No, I don't do the pumice stone and all that craziness. For one, I don't like the way it looks. It makes the wood look muddy to me. Those of you who like to stain everything to match at the end might prefer that look. It's just not me. And epoxy does another thing for me. It really toughens up an all wood binding, brings it up almost to the same level of density in the end as a nice ABS binding. So it actually does provide a good protection if the instrument gets bumped or dropped. I prefer the System 3 SB112 for one reason only. It's the only epoxy I can find that's absolutely clear. It's all but water white. Those of you who are around the finishing game will know what that term means, but it means clear. And this is it. Every other epoxy out there, even every other epoxy made by this same company, has an amber tint to it and won't do everything I want it to do. This product allows me to do a lot of things that you give up in a traditional French polish versus a lacquer finish. And we'll get to that a little later on in the process. So I'm using this epoxy, and I'm also adding a silica thickener. If you want, you can come up and take a look at this stuff. Watch out, this is like a major contaminant. I take this over into the washroom and open this up and get a certain amount out when I'm mixing epoxy. This stuff will get everywhere. It'll wind up in your finish. I mean, it's a contaminant when it's loose. So to mix the epoxy, what we have to do, I recommend weighing it. We're going to mix real small volumes. I got a little digital scale right here. You can get this puppy at Harbor Freight for $10. There's no excuse not to have one in your shop. You can use it for all kinds of stuff if you want. You can weigh bridge pins, you can weigh saddles, you can weigh nuts, you can weigh tuners. I even weigh my plates on it. It has enough capacity to weigh a fully braced plate, you know? So basically I just take 2 little plastic cups, put on my scale, calibrate it. We put 10 grams of resin and we put 4.4 grams of hardener in there. It's going to make about a ½ ounce of epoxy. That's going to be plenty to do 1 coat on 1 guitar. I usually finish more than 1 guitar at once, but I only mix that much epoxy. I do them one at a time. It starts to gel up fairly quickly, and you'll find you're going to work pretty good to actually get that epoxy on this guitar before it starts to gel to the point where it's tough to get into the pores. It won't want to go in there. So we mix that up really, really good for about 60, 90 seconds. And we add our thickening paste, our thickening powder. And we just start adding that in and we're whipping it. And all of a sudden you're going to notice it's going to get a little milky looking. And right after that it's going to like poof. It's going to turn into almost like whipped cream. That's when it's right. Stop putting this in. Make sure you got it all mixed. Now we need to apply it actually to the guitar. And there's a lot of products we can use for that. You can get these deals at your local auto body supply store. They're for spreading body color. Which, by the way, if you don't know where that is, if you're going to be finishing guitars, get to know your local auto body supplier. He's got wet dry paper, he's got lacquer-proof masking tape, he's got these things, he's got stuff you didn't even know you needed till you walked in his door. Go see him. They also got these. I like this one a lot. These are actually designed for squeegeeing water off when you wet sand a car. But they work great for pore filling sides. Haven't actually tried this yet, but I'm going to try a window squeegee this next time around. I think this is going to be a handy way to actually really get it packed into them pores nice and neat. And it's, you know, basically what you do is, you know, you're going to take your guitar, you're going to put a little dab on there, and you're going to wipe like this across the grain. Just like that. You're going to leave a nice build of epoxy on there. I mean, don't go nuts. You don't want to leave an 1/8 inch on here, but you want to leave a coating. You want to coat this whole thing. You want to make sure you press hard enough to work it down into them pores, but don't keep going over it. You'll just start dragging it back out. Avoid that urge to make it look pretty and go with the grain. Nothing rakes it back out of the pores. You just put it in quicker than going with the grain. It pushes it all up to one end. Leaves half every pore open. Make sure you get it packed in nice at your bindings everywhere. If there is a little gap that you couldn't actually see, that stuff will get right in there and fill it up. Bring it right up to level. Comes to the front of the guitar, I usually just take my finger with a rubber glove, actually a vinyl glove, and I'll smear some into my wood bindings very carefully. I'll do the same with my rosette. If I would have a small chip, if you got that little piece of tear out that you just couldn't sand out where the grain was disagreeable when you planed your top, put a little dab of that right in there. It'll be fine. You can't fix major defects with it. It's not putty. You can't fill bad workmanship. They had to be fixed before. So we put that in there. We're going to let that cure now, depending on your actual shop environment, for 3 to 6 hours maybe. We're going to come back. We're going to take a metal scraper, which I'm sure everyone has. I forgot to grab one off my bench, with a nice fine burr turned on it. And we're just going to scrape that epoxy back down. We're going to scrape it back down until it's nice and level, and we got little bits of bare wood and stuff showing through. This piece has actually been sanded. I'll pass this around. You can see here where it started out, how the coat was left on, and then this over here has been scraped and sanded. So you guys can all take a look at that. That's a piece of rosewood off one of the guitars I finished a little while ago. So after you scrape it, you're going to let it set. It needs to set 24 hours. And you're going to come back. You're going to repeat that same process. You're not going to sand it again right now. There's no point in it. You're going to repeat that process. You're going to mix another ½ ounce of epoxy with the thickener in it. You're going to do the exact same thing you just did. Because it shrank into them pores. You'll still see little glassy spots peeking back at you. Prep our pore-filled guitar for a finish. So what I normally do at this point I'll just prep sand the entire guitar 220. I do a lot of sanding by hand, just something I've learned to do over the years. I also use a lot of these, which are just pieces of plywood with 1/4-inch cork glued to them. Wrap your sandpaper around that, give it a good sand. Now, one of the main differences you'll notice between a lot of French polish finishes and a lacquer finish, you'll notice that French polish seems to show a lot more of the wood. You get them waves and ripples in the wood if you actually start looking. Well, that's because when you spray an instrument with lacquer and you come back and level sand it fills in all them little voids. Some of them voids only measure 1/1000th of an inch, but boy, they can really scatter light reflections. By using SB112, which is clear, we can actually do that little bit of fairing. We can leave that 1/1000th hang in a couple of spots where we need to, where the grain undulates between the spring and summer grains in the wood. And it'll bridge that right in and it'll make it perfectly smooth, just like that piece of rosewood you were looking at. This guitar was done that way. I happen to know in certain spots there's quite a bit of epoxy fairing in certain sections of this particular guitar. And I'm almost willing to bet that until I point them out, you all aren't going to find them. You want to come up and look for them after the presentation, knock yourself out. I'll buy you a Pepsi if you find one. So I sand this all out to 220. Now, if I was going to actually lacquer this instrument, I would probably sand it at 180. Okay, I do both. This is my standard finish, but if someone wants a lacquer finish, I will do it. That allows me to keep all my guitars single stream up to that point, because I'm usually doing 3 at a time. So then I can simply sand the lacquered one differently and set it aside to be sprayed and continue with my French polish. These get sanded out to a 220. Shellac doesn't need anywhere near as big of an anchor as a lacquer or any other type of finish. So now we've got it all pore filled, we've got it all sanded up. We're ready to start with shellac, so I'm going to put some of this stuff away. First thing we got to do, we got to mix our shellac. Don't buy your shellac pre-mixed. Shellac is a natural protein. It expires. It's expendable. It rots. It molds. I buy nothing but button lac. The way this stuff is made is some of the hardest, toughest shellac you'll ever find. It's actually polymerized. They didn't know that 200 years ago when they started heating the stuff up and squeezing it through gauze, that that's what they were doing. They just knew it made it tougher. This is the stuff they used to use on them ballroom floors. This stuff's hard. I'll pass these around to you. These are actual shellac buttons. I use Kuzmi #1, which is spring harvest from a particular region. You can use any button lac you want. There's different shades, different colors.
Brian, can you extend the life of the buttons by freezing them or putting them in a refrigerator?
The buttons themselves are actually very, very stable. Just keep them out of the sunlight. And they probably have a shelf life of, I would guess, about 2 years. I don't keep that large, I buy it a pound at a time. So, I don't keep more than that on hand at any time.
And the flake is much less?
Well, most of your flakes are de-waxed.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? So this is a natural waxed shellac. This is what them guys did 150 years ago. This is probably something similar to what C.F. Martin actually did 150 years ago. So the first thing you want to do with them, you want to weigh them out. You want to make your cut. Exact pound cut, you'll hear guys whine incessantly about it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You're going to adjust that further when we put it on. I go between a 1.5 and a 2 pound cut, somewhere in there. It's usually about 7 ounces of buttons. I just toss them on the scale on between 7 and 8 ounces, and that's good enough for me. I stick them in a bag, I crack them up with a hammer, I pour them in a jar, and for my recipe, that 7.5 or whatever ounces, that goes in a quart mason jar. I fill that up almost to the top with my alcohol, and I pass it off to my shop associate, and she agitates it for me. She's very good at agitating things. Now this is actually some of it right here. Takes a couple days to dissolve, and the mix might take out to a week. depending on how cool it is when you're trying to do it. So don't get excited. I mean, just shake it every now and again, you know, and roll it around. It'll dissolve. And this is what you wind up with. Now, after you do all that, you gotta strain it. You gotta run it through a strainer, and I don't mean the Mrs.'s cauliflower colander. I mean an actual finished strainer. Okay, get some of these when you're at the auto body supply store. They're cheap. You'll be amazed at the amount of crap that comes out of there. There's tree bark in there. There's dead bug carcasses in there. There's Lord knows what in there. A quart of natural shellac will pollute this thing. You'll have a sizable mass of crud when you strain out that quart.
I back you up. How long does it stay in that suspended state?
It will start to separate out. That does not render it unusable, but you do need to use that within 3 months of mixing it.
Oh, okay.
It will deteriorate. What happens is, while it's in solution, the protein chain will start to break down, and it won't reform when the alcohol evaporates out. Okay? So once it's mixed, it has a definite shelf life. Again, keeping it out of the sunlight is always beneficial. I keep mine in a dark little cabinet when I'm not using it.
You reshake it when you
Right.
get it?
If you actually want to de-wax the shellac, if you really feel the need to do that, you can de-wax that shellac. You'll be amazed at how much wax is in there if you do it. Just let that jar sit someplace for about 2 weeks or so, and all the wax will settle down to the bottom, and you can siphon the pure shellac, whatever that means, off of it, and use just that, and have, what you'll have is 2/3 of a jar of wax and virtually no shellac, which is going to be so thin, you're actually going to spend 80 hours trying to put it on the guitar instead of 40. Plus, you're going to have to do some other things that I don't like. So the wax is part of the finish. It comes in handy a little bit later. So we've just mixed and strained it. So the next thing we're going to need a mouse. And I guess
Ask me, what does it smell like? I didn't open it, and I can't really smell the jar so much, but does it
Well,
got
I'm
an
gonna-
odor to it?
Yeah, I'm going to open it up because I'm going to actually make a mouse right now.
Oh, man, that's pretty, that's
Yeah,
like
it's
airplane
not-
dough.
It's not, it won't do that to you. It's not like lacquer fumes, but it's definitely not, I mean, it's not, scent-free. It's not all that pleasant, I mean, you do a lot of French polishing in a closed room, you're gonna need a vent fan. You're gonna want one. So what we need to do is make what's called a mouse or a pad or a municio, whatever you wanna call it. I like the term mouse because when used properly, they squeak just like a mouse. I thought maybe it's because they were named after little cat toys, but they actually do squeak. So one of the first things I also need to do, we need some alcohol on our bench. Now, at this point, I never work with clean alcohol again during the finish process. And since I got some guitars coming up for finishing, I'm just going to go ahead right here and make a supply of what I need, and I'll take this home and use it. So the first thing I want some dirty liquor. Ask anyone who knew me back in the day, they'll tell you. I'm going to transfer some shellac into my alcohol until it's got that nice tinge to it. Probably wondering why I just did that. It ensures that I never touch this surface with pure alcohol ever again. All my alcohol's got at least a little bit of wax in it. And this will get thicker and darker as I work. Eventually I'll start running out and I'll just add more alcohol and it'll fluctuate back and forth. But I never personally want to put fresh, clean alcohol against this finish as I start to build it, because that increases the chance of actually lifting the finish right back off. And then you'll find out just how easy it is to repair French polish finish. It might be easy 20 years down the road after the stuff's really dry, but when you're actually trying to put it on a regular basis, it can be one of the most obstinate things to fill back in. It really can. It can be maddening. So my advice is to work carefully and avoid that. So I got my liquor, I got my shellac, now we got to make a mouse. For my mice, I buy 2 types of cloth. I buy clean white flannel, which I cut into squares, about 3 inches square. And I just keep these handy because you'll need more of these as you go on. I buy clean white cotton, and I cut this into 5. A lot of these duvets are covers. So you need 2 pieces of this, You set that down here. You need two of these. The first one, you're just going to ball right on up. Ball that up. Okay, we're going to dip that in our alcohol. We're going to wring it out. So I'll wad that up. Make a nice little ball. Put that in. So, we're going to put some shellac in there. We're also going to put some alcohol in there. We're always going to be putting both in there. That's why the cut really doesn't matter. Because we just changed it. So we got some alcohol in there. I'm going to wrap this guy right back up. I'm going to wrap this guy up like this. And flatten him out. We're going to blot it. And of course, since it's new, it's way too wet and it has no shellac in it. So we'll just have to let that guy sit for a minute. Actually, what I'm going to do, just in the interest of time, I'm just going to load it up. From this point on, every time you load this, you're simply going to open it up, and that little top on the Hershey's Kiss we twisted, you're going to be putting drops of shellac and drops of alcohol right there. And that's going to flow down through this core that we made and actually get pressed out the bottom. It takes quite a bit to load up a new mouse because it takes a lot of material to actually saturate this core. Once you get going, you're only going to be putting a few drops of each in here. Usually, the average bodying session might be 6 drops of shellac and 3 or 4 drops of alcohol per loading of the mouse. Now you can see I'm starting to get some shellac running through there. That's way too wet. But you can get away with it being way too wet at first. When you start off with, this is a lousy prepped piece of wood. When you start off with a clean piece of wood, your first coat, you can be really, really wet right now. And all I'm doing is just rubbing around in little circles. I'm going to go over this piece here like this. And you're just going to work like this. Moderate pressure. Like I said, it's a lot like sanding. And I said, this piece of wood, I thought this was prepped a little better when I grabbed it out of my little rack, but it's not. The other side is, so we'll be working on that a little bit. So it's starting to get a little dry now. We're going to load it up. We're going to go about 6 or 8 drops. About 3 drops. Every time you start a session, you're going to start off putting more alcohol in your mouse, or I mean more shellac than alcohol. As you work your way through a session and start to build a polish, that's going to start to change. You're going to start putting more alcohol and less shellac. Each session should start out with a little less shellac than what you used the last time around. And you can see this is starting to seal up right now. Now one thing you have to start keeping an eye on is your duvet, the cover on your mouse. It's going to start wearing away. This one hasn't yet. This one's picking up a lot of dirt though. But it'll start to actually, I brought an old one along. This one's actually up in my finishing cabinet. I would never reuse it, but there you can see it. There's a hole wore right through it. You want to stop when that starts happening, hopefully before, because them old fibers are getting in your finish and you're going to have to work either with them or work them back out at some point. That's another reason for the double coat of cotton, so that when it does start to go through a little bit, you're not hitting that core and starting to really lift the shellac back off. And you're just going to keep going around the guitar. Vary your pattern. Sometimes I go straight up and down, and then the next time I'll go around the edge and circle my way in. I also have a pattern I use when I finish. After a while, it's going to start to build up. You're going to start to have something that looks a little more like this. This is probably 2 sessions on here. This is actually part of a finishing sample I was working up the other month.
What's the minimum time to clean your session?
Well, after you finish a session, we're not actually done with it yet. We're going to let this sit for maybe 45 minutes to an hour. Again, depending on your shop conditions, how warm and dry it actually is in there. Then we got to come back and do something that you'll never hear these guys who use olive oil do, because they can't do it, because the olive oil won't let you do it. Anyone ever hear the term used? I'm going to give you a good shellacking. You know where it comes from? comes from this process right here. After this is set up for about 45 minutes to an hour, we've got to pummel it. We've got to give it a good shellacking. So we come back in, and this time we want to actually have our mouse, we're going to load it with primarily just dirty liquor. It still has shellac in it. We're going to make it just damp. I mean, just barely damp. When you blot it, after you tamp it, every time you put shellac in it, we're going to tamp it on a board, and we're going to blot it on a piece of paper and look at the pattern that comes out of it. I don't know if you guys can see that there, but I mean, it's just a little crosshatch, like a screen print pattern that actually comes out of here. You want it to be on the dry side, and then we're going to pummel it. And this is actually a little wetter than I would like. Sounds just like a boxer hitting a speed bag, don't it? Give it a good shellacking. That actually compresses and amalgamates that shellac. That forces that protein together. That toughens the coating. If you were using oil to lubricate your mouse, you can't do that because you got olive oil in there. That's got to work its way back out of the finish. If you tried that, you'd probably wind up with fish eyes. You'd encapsulate it somewhere. With a waxed shellac, you don't have to worry about that. I don't need any lube. I can polish away. It'll stick, it'll drag, it'll squeak, but it won't actually lift any finish off. The wax prevents that from happening. The only time it will lift finish, if your mouse is too wet. If this is too wet, if you got too much alcohol on this, you touch it down, it'll lift it right back up. So now as we start building up these different sessions that we're going, and we're going to get about 3 sessions into this, now's when the real amalgamation starts. This is when we really start to work this finish. So when we start back in on like the 3rd, 4th, 5th session, we're going to start polishing, and we're going to keep polishing, and we're going to keep polishing. And the whole time we're working this surface, everything that we've already put on is softening underneath it. It's going to start to get gummy. It's going to get to the point where you could actually take your thumb and go like that and leave a thumbprint in it. When it gets to that point, you can walk the razor's edge and keep building polish quite quickly, but you also run the risk now of lifting a big chunk of it back off. I'm not that lucky. I don't push things that much. I know people who do. I've seen it done. You can do this very quickly and efficiently if you get a feel for working that gummy surface. I stop at that point. I let it dry that 45 minutes to an hour, come back, pummel it, and then let it dry for 8-10 hours before I do another session. Generally 1 session a day. Like I say, I'm building 3 guitars at a time, so yeah. If I can get a session in on every guitar in a day, I'm generally a happy guy anyway. You know, if I can do all the sides of it, front, the sides, the back, and the necks, on all 3 of them, well, that's a good day. Be smooth at this point. It's going to have all kinds of little swirls and circles. As a matter of fact, if you look at this headstock, I had to refinish this, and I didn't want to pull the tuner bushings to repolish it. And you can see the swirls that get left behind naturally on that. So after we're completely done with that, we pummeled it for the last time, we're going to let it set for another whole day. And then we're going to come back through, make sure I'm not missing anything. Another warning, when you're finishing, edges always take more work. Concentrate on these edges. The polish will build quick in the center of the instrument, not so much at the edges, because you don't spend as much time out there as you think you do. So we've got it all on, we're happy, it's looking nice and glossy, but it's real humpy bumpy, it's not very smooth looking, but it's got a good color, it's got nice shine to it. So we let that dry for a day, and then we're going to do a little bit of stretching. Now you can actually completely complete this process by stretching the shellac if you want. I do a little bit of it just to make the bumping go a little easier, but you know, what you're doing is you're going to make a new mouse. It's not really going to have any shellac in it. You're going to load it up pretty much primarily with dirty liquor, probably a bit dirtier than this, a little bit darker in color. And you're going to do this. You're going to fly in and off, going straight up and down with the grain. Just like that. And I'm applying pretty good pressure too. I mean, you're going to need to apply as much pressure as you're comfortable applying through this whole process on your instruments. The more pressure, the better it works. being as we're dealing with thin, fragile woods, of course, there's a limit to how much pressure you can exert before you crack a top or a back plate, so use a little common sense. But that will help start to eliminate those little ridges. It'll start to smooth them out. Like I say, you can actually keep doing that the whole way. That's the way it was probably done 200 years ago, and it works. I'll do that till I get probably, I don't know, maybe half them ridges gone. That's good enough for me. Again, I'll let that set overnight. Then we get into the glazing, or buffing as you might know. And yeah, I do buff my French polish. You know, like I say, you don't have to. You can continue stretching it out if that's what you want to do. Let me get some more of my little friends on here. Right here. That's all I use at this point. I use some 1200 wet dry paper. I wrap that around there. Actually, I'd tear this down so the piece was smaller. I'm pretty frugal when it comes to sandpaper. This is actually sized so that when I wrap a full sheet around the larger block that I showed you earlier, the edges that you don't use can be cut off and wrapped around this, and they're the perfect size. No abrasive gets out of my shop unused. The stuff's too expensive. So tear a little piece of this off. And at this point, we are actually going to use a little olive oil. This is where I use the olive oil. And put a couple drops of olive oil in there and smear it around. And this is probably a bit gummy, so this is probably going to work very poorly at this point. Plus it's a little thin. Then I'm just going to go through and I'm going to sand. I'm going to sand away as much of them swirl marks as I want. You can make it completely flat if you want, just like I made the neck. I tend to usually leave just a trace of the hand-applied nature of the finish behind, so it looks kind of a little bit like a flamenco guitar. That's my personal preference. You can do however you like to do. So we're just going to be careful. The olive oil will make this 1200 grit paper cut like you wouldn't believe. This shellac is incredibly thin. You can sand right through it if you aren't careful. Work carefully and lightly. All you want to do is knock down them high ridges. It's not going to sand out like lacquer. It's not going to get that perfect snowy flat look to it like you get when you sand out lacquer. Okay, it's not. Even this neck probably did not get that way. You know, it will improve at the next part of this process. So we've done that. We've got it all sanded now. We did put some olive oil on there that we've got to deal with because that could get to be a problem. I can't come back at this with alcohol anymore because the alcohol will redissolve the shellac and pull it right off. So at this point I'm forced to use a little bit of naphtha. And I'm not going to open this in here because this stuff smells bad. But I'll take a rag, a clean rag with naphtha, and that'll pull that olive oil right back off that wood. You won't have to worry about it. And then we come back in. I use Novus number 2. This is a wonderful all-purpose polish. Works great for repairs, for finishing. Even my lacquer stuff, I don't have a big all-door buffer. I have no interest in owning one, no place to have one. Don't need it to chuck guitars across my shop for me when I'm not paying attention. I use this instead. Old world technology. This is a felt block. You can get this puppy at Woodcraft for like 15 bucks. You can get them at Highland Woodworking Supply. This is how they used to rub out finishes 100 years ago before they had them things. And simply I just put, that's too sticky. Squirt some of this on your felt block and start buffing. Again, it takes pressure. And that shine will just come right on up. I mean, you'll be amazed how effective it is. Felt block won't burn through your corners and edges. You know, it's soft enough that you can get all the way out to your edges and buff everything out, not have to worry about it. Between sanding with a 1200 grit and polishing out with this Novus number 2, that's it. This finish is done. After your initial level sand to your repair, you can go 3 and 2 and, you know, eliminate a bit of the sanding involved with it. You can start off a bit coarser. You could sand it for other things. So you might want to get a couple of these. All right, so now our finish is technically done. Now we got to preserve it. It's not going to stay like that all on its own. By using a waxed shellac, one of the benefits we have is we can actually apply a furniture wax to this. It'll bond incredibly well. I mean, that wax they actually take out all the shellacs that everyone else is using, you know what they do with it? They make furniture wax out of it. They sell it back to you as a protective coating for your finish. I happen to like, I'm fond of Butcher's Boston polish. It's one of my favorites. I think it has a nice natural tone. It's easy enough to use. This is almost a lifetime supply. I mean, it really doesn't take that much. And this actually provides the surface. This is what's going to take the wear of use. This is what's going to absorb those little abrasions from belt buckles and shirt sleeve buttons. This is what's going to keep the player's perspiration from lifting shellac back off the lower bout right here like you see. This right here. And you can renew it anytime it needs it. You put good coat of this on. Actually, after you first finish an instrument, you're probably going to have to put 4 to 6 coats of this on, spread out over 2 to 3 days each to get a good base of wax to actually form a protective layer. It knits right in with the shellac. It feeds back into the shellac. It keeps the shellac nice and happy because it is a natural product, you know. It doesn't let the shellac dry out and get brittle, which again helps the finish last longer. And you know, if you get some fingerprints or smudges on it, you don't need a can of polish or anything. You just need the clean rag out of your case, and you should be able to buff that right back out. No problem. Sweat will wipe right off of it. Sweat will actually bead up on the stuff. You just wipe it right off before you put it away. You notice that's not the case. It's time for a coat of wax, or in general, every time I change strings, I'll give a guitar a coat of wax. When you apply this, I take a small, clean piece of cotton, make it nice and damp. A little bit of wax, just tap it in the can. All you want to see is a light haze of wax. It's not like waxing your car. Don't put a coating of it on and come back and try and take it off. You're going to make a mess. It's just a light haze that you see. That same type of haze you see when you're putting the shellac on behind your mouse. That's what you're going to see when you wax. That nice little haze. And that's going to dry in a couple of minutes, and you can buff it right back off. That's pretty much all there really is to it. I mean, that's all the maintenance there is to it. I mean, like I say, this one's been dropped, it's been kicked around. Take a look at the scratches on the other side of it. Yes?
Brian.